So welcome, everybody. We are going to do a tabletop exercise on open source. And without further ado, I think we should do introduction. And I think we need all our panelists on the stage. Sarah, where? Okay, Sarah is here. Sarah is here. All right. So I think we are good. So once again, I'm Dana Wang. I'm the chief architect for OpenSSF, and I'm going to moderate the session. We have a very diverse panel of people on stage and off stage. Unfortunately, you can see the stage is very crowded. We have to distribute our participants into different locations, very distributed team structure. I think the introduction will start from our maintainers and go all the way back to the consumers. Joe, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. Hey everybody, I'm Joel Marcey. I'm Director of Technology at the Rust Foundation, supporting all the technical initiatives, programs, and engineers that the foundation has, and it's great to be here. Thanks.
I'm Sarah Evans. I work with Dell Technologies in the Office of the CTO. I do security innovation research, and I have the great opportunity to work with OpenSSF with a lot of our maintainer community, and also we do a lot of software development at Dell and work in and also participate in the open source community. So grateful to be here on their behalf here at this tabletop today.
Hey everybody, I'm CRob. I do stuff on the internet. Some of that stuff on the internet is I get to work with a group called the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams. So I've helped write a couple industry frameworks. I participate in creating the CVE, CVSS, CWE, VEX, and a couple other different standards related to vulnerability response. At the foundation, I am the chairperson of the TAC. I also help lead the Developer Best Practices Working Group and the Vulnerability Disclosures Working Group.
Hey everyone, I'm Seth Larson. I'm the Security Developer in Residence at the Python Software Foundation, and I'm in charge of basically raising the security posture of the entire Python ecosystem. And in my free time, I'm an open source maintainer of a few critical projects in the Python ecosystem.
Hi, I'm Mike Lieberman. I'm a co-founder of Kusari, a software supply chain security startup. I'm also a TAC and governing board member of the OpenSSF and a CNCF tag security lead. And I also maintain several open source projects, including including Salsa and Guac, which are both part of the OpenSSF.
Yeah, good afternoon. Ian Barbour with Control Plane. I'm dwarfed by a lot of very well-profounded people here. I do security stuff, and that's about it.
Hey, I'm Lelia. I'm open source architect at Cisco's open source program office. I also do security stuff of late, and just generally like doing open source, automating, making it easier to get people involved.
I'm Ryan Ware. I work for Intel. We're in the Open Ecosystem Organization, where I'm Director of Open Source Security. In OpenSSF, I run the Security Tooling Working Group. I'm Intel's alternate on the governing board, and am now participating in the Technical Response Committee, supporting the Public Policy Committee.
I'm Eric Brewer, a fellow at Google and former professor and long ago coder. I helped start the OpenSSF. I'm now the board chair. Also helped start CNCF for Kubernetes, and care deeply about the kind of the full stack of this space.
Hey, I'm Bryan Fox, co-founder, CTO at Sonatype. I'm also on the governing board, the governance committee, and the technical response committee here at the OpenSSF. The role I'm playing, Sonatype runs the Maven Central repository, so I'm here representing the public repositories in this.
Hi guys, Lakkakula. I'm the head of product security for developer platforms in JPMorgan Chase. I'm also on the OpenSSF board. The role I'm playing is an end user or a consumer of open source of a big company.
Hi everyone, my name is Payne, and I lead vulnerability management for this little cloud that you might have heard of called AWS. And I'm also playing one of the end users in this role today.
Great. So let's do the security stuff since everyone here is in the security field. So what we are going to simulate is a security incident happening in a large enterprise organization. And our security analyst, Ian, is going to walk us through what's happening.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to cheat and read this off the sheet because I'm a little jet lagged. First things first, we do have a repo. Thanks to CRob for letting us host some TTX documents there. If you're security technically minded and you want to run through this scenario back to front through attack flows, feel free to visit the repo, and you can follow the instructions and go from there. So first breakthrough is the initial incident. A large, mature organization has disclosed a security incident, as encouraged by the Circular Act. We're currently on few details, but what they consist of is a security analyst has identified anomalous egress connections from their cloud estate. They've traced the connection originating from workloads running on their Kubernetes cluster. These workloads run a business application with access to confidential data. They've noticed from the cluster logs that workloads are running some commands against the cluster API. This is harvesting runtime and environmental information. The workloads have recently been updated as part of routine patching, which coincide with the timing of some of the suspicious alerts that have been generated. At this point, the incident response team is still investigating ongoing threats.
So it's a lot of details. I think if I summarize it, basically, Ian, as the security analyst for the large enterprise organization, he observes abnormal egress traffic. And as the initial investigation, he found out that the egress traffic is related to cloud workloads that recently had a release. So I think, Ian, if you can educate us, what are the typical steps that an organization will take at this initial stage of the incident response?
Yeah, okay, so in this scenario, I'll play the role of kind of a security analyst, probably working in the SOC. If anyone's ever had to do that role, apologies, you know how tireless that is. Typically, you kind of get two ways that this will get raised to you. Either probably a junior analyst gets an alert that everyone ignores, but they might think that there might be something to this. Or it kind of comes through kind of business as usual chains. The scapegoat for this is kind of XE utils, right? Somebody looked at something abnormal and realized something was wrong. At that point, you're going to kind of confirm true positives. The junior analyst will probably speak to a senior analyst, get them on board, start investigating things. That kind of kicks off your incident response process. Internally to an organization, it should be really mentioned, you know, this is specific to inside an organization. Once you start to move into open source world, that's kind of completely different. This is its own topic and can go on, you know, you can do training for hours on this. The key thing to mention here, though, is A, confirm it's true positive, and have some sort of playbook that you'll start to work off. If I'm being completely honest, playbooks kind of go out the window for a lot of this stuff. You can, like, prepare for it. Depending on the scenario, the playbooks are great, right? If it's, you know, roll back a patch on a server because it's an obvious issue, just roll it back. If it's slightly more complicated to that, again, being very, very honest and upfront about this, your lead engineers and security people are just going to take over. They kind of have the experience and the training to do this. The juniors can learn where possible, but this is where the people aspect of incident response is kind of paramount. It's getting people trained up in identifying signs and chasing things down. The core risk of this is kind of red herrings as you go. People who aren't experienced will tag on to things that they think are relevant but aren't. Your CTI team can be the worst enemy here. They might start talking about Russia and China. They've seen, you know, indicators, which throws you completely off track. And it can be something really simple, right? Like a dev has committed something and accidentally introduced a breaking change, and they just need to go and investigate and roll it back. That kickstarts the incident response process. That team will then come together. That involves pretty much everybody from the business. And then again, that falls into its own ecosystem of how you deal with that incident, what your response steps are, how you resolve it, how that reports out through media if you need to, how you'll close down the incident, and then kind of lessons learned. But again, that's a huge topic that takes much longer than kind of 2 minutes, so I'll pass
Yeah,
it over.
thank you, Ian. That's a lot of details and very helpful education. So I think the next step is Ian observes initial abnormal traffic. So the security analysts are busy with analyzing. Then I think the next question I'm going to direct to Ryan. So Ryan, you are overseeing the security operations for this fictional organization. What steps or what actions are you going to recommend your teams taking to further the investigation?
Thanks, Dana. So there's definitely a number of things that you want to touch upon here. And one of the things you always need to keep in mind is the clock is ticking. And you may not understand that until you're under the pressure of doing that. But the clock is ticking. VPs want answers now. You got phone calls because they saw stories on TV. You know, it's a energizing experience, shall we say? Dun dun. So I mean, a lot of companies are only focused on viewing things internally. They aren't looking external. And when something like this happens, especially when it's in an open source component, you got to start focusing on looking at every single piece of open source software you're ingesting as part of your project. If you're not, guess what? You're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. So you got to start focusing on that. You need to look at data sources too to understand what are people outside saying about this vulnerability and what's happening with your product and the vulnerability. You may not have the capability of doing forensics internally. I at Intel, I'm fortunate that I have some very wonderful folks in our InfoSec org who are doing exquisite jobs when it comes to forensics. You may be in a small company who may not have that capability. Go find it immediately. Don't touch the systems. Let somebody actually do the forensics and not ruin the data for you. Definitely, you may unfortunately need to bring down some services that you don't want to limit the blast radius of what's going on. You want to make sure you're doing some monitoring of traffic and continue doing that, of course. You may need to back out changes that you introduced, which may fix the problem for you. I know your customers don't like losing features, but if they have to lose features to be secure, they'll take that trade-off, but just complain about it. Third-party involvement, I unfortunately have required the services of experts who could go talk with folks like the FBI and others, because if there is exploitation going on, you're going to want to talk to the authorities. Please establish a war room with a one voice policy. Do not let random people in your company go start posting blogs about what is going on. It never, ever ends well.
Thank you, Ryan. Lessons learned. So as Ryan busy with making decisions, Ian is also busy with further investigation. So Ian, what do you see?
Yeah, sure. So within the context, the security analysts have started looking at this incident, and this is where we find ourselves. So they've looked at the build account, the CI/CD build accounts. The response team have traced the event back to a specific pipeline execution. They're looking at logs, speaking with developers, trying to understand root cause. What they have found is that there were some images that are pulled from a public repo. So, probably not sanitizing those images, no kind of proxy service to store them like Artifactory and then bring them in. So some best practices lacking here. From further review, it's a specific container image that they've seen has introduced some issues, let's say, just from looking at audit logs. They've obtained a copy of the image and they're running investigation, but there's no signs of image tampering. It's been signed as part of the pipeline execution, and nothing really out of the ordinary that you can spot. While this is going on, they have done some good practice. They've put enhanced monitoring in place across the suspicious workloads. Unfortunately, there are signs of RCE, so remote code execution, which is never good. But the vulnerability management team have reported that there's no known CVEs. CTI team have reported no known CVEs, no known indicators at the moment that they can see in the wild. At the moment, everything's pointing to a 0 day, just based off what the observables are currently being seen.
Thank you, Ian. So to summarize the discovery details, essentially, Ian found out he can pinpoint the anomaly to a specific CI/CD execution, and was able to pinpoint the root cause is from an open source container image. And he couldn't find anywhere for signs of compromise. So now the question is, what did Ian's stakeholders do to help him to drive to this point? So I think the next question is going to go to Lelia. So Lelia, you are the application owner for this particular applications that has issues. What actions did you take to help Ian to drive to the conclusion?
All right, I am the application owner. So yeah, it's a tough job, but someone's got to do it. So I mean, I think, taking a step back, we also want to make sure that the actual repository where the, application is being developed is itself as secure as possible. So this might involve, just looking at who actually has access to push to the main branch of this repository, right? Like we want to follow a model of, least permission necessary to still get the job done and not bottleneck people. So maybe that means removing administrative access to this project that isn't necessarily required. Maybe it means that if pull requests are being pushed through without any sort of review process, introducing a formal review process and a minimum number of required reviewers would be great. Would be even better if CI checks were passing before that review were to get merged in. So making sure that all of that kind of stuff is already locked in as far as best practices go, even before we consider pushing and deploying the code out to the world. When it comes to the CI/CD pipeline itself, we probably want to look at, is the CI/CD pipeline all self-contained? Is it triggering another downstream job? Could that job itself have vulnerabilities? I think there was some mention of pulling in container images from a public source, so that might be something that I think somebody else made a point of perhaps considering that we store that stuff in an internal storage, such as Artifactory or something equivalent. Maybe at minimum, if that's not available to you from an infrastructure perspective, you want at least get away from pulling in the latest and greatest version and pinning to a specific version for those containers would be a great starting point. Other things like making sure that commits are signed, making sure that they're being reviewed properly, making sure that with the CI/CD pipeline that it's not, creating vulnerabilities for remote execution to take place. Also looking at who actually has access to the CI/CD pipeline itself, which sometimes can be different from who has administrative access to the Git repository, or I think in this case it's GitLab self-hosted. Where is the CI/CD pipeline actually running? Is it running on self-hosted runners? Is it running in the cloud? Who else might have access to those runners? Is there some sort of remote SSH access vulnerability that could be exploited? Those are some of the things that I would want to start looking at. Maybe having, reviewer groups on the repository, making sure that dependencies are being pinned, and making sure that there's some sort of automated review process associated with that. Just general best practices, things along those lines. Might not necessarily get you to the root cause of this specific 0 day, but it should put you in a better place going forward to have more confidence that you can minimize the potential sources of weakness, as this hopefully doesn't happen again, but it might.
Thank you, Lelia. So I think I want to point out why I asked Lelia that question. When something happens, we always look at our own flaws first. So the threat models that I tend to reference for the supply chain threats are, I borrowed it from sales framework. So in this diagram, you can see that from the moment the software is being produced, to the point that it's checked into the source control system, go through the build process and inject the dependencies, to the point that the package is being distributed to the consumers. and then down to the consumers to ingest the software. Every component in this chain has issues. So what Lelia just talked about was really about, hey, when I look at my internal supply chain threats, what are the threat factors? And by looking at each component, Lelia basically ruled out her application itself didn't have any signs of compromise. So now I think I'm going to direct the next question to the organization level. So individual application level, Lelia drew the conclusion that it points to the sign of open source compromise or open source vulnerability. At the organization level, then what we need to look at. So Raul, I'm going to direct this question to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Dana. So I think before we jumping into the key importance of a asset inventory, I want to step one step backwards and see, because we started as a large organization. So the key in the large organization is to understand what are the software development practices you have. It's not straightforward. There's typically a central CI/CD pipeline that most of the applications go through their build and deployment, but there are some other applications which they have their own shadow IT with their own CI/CD pipelines. Also, not all applications are internally developed. You have third-party vendor applications come in. You have dependency on some other applications which are developed by the third-party software groups that you borrow code from. So I think understanding all those complexity of where the software coming into the form is very key, because then you can build a accurate inventory of where the software is and also where it is deployed to, so that you can minimize the damage of this an attack. And then on the software side, obviously you mentioned there's internal software, but most of the applications these days, 90% of the code is open source. So the open source supply chain is a very key. So the key there is build the inventory of not just the dependencies the application uses, also the transitive dependencies. So you have to go to the deep level of get all the transitive dependencies the applications are using. Also, if it is a third-party application, identify if there's a way you can get all that transitive dependencies through SBOMs. We talked SBOMs a lot in this morning, and I think we can talk later in the session too. But those are the ways you can get all the inventories. And as I said, it's the software supply chain left side, also where it is deployed, all the hardware and all the platform it is being deployed to is a key to manage the instance.
Thank you, Raul. So as the incident evolves, Lelia rules out the incident comes from internally by looking at her own application end to end. And Raul was looking at the organization level, how to mitigate the risk. So then, at the same time, Ian is still busy with all the findings. So Ian, do you want to walk us through your final findings?
I guess so, yeah. So the scenario evolves a bit more. Internal investigations have concluded and found the exploit has spread across various resources. So it's not a single resource at this point. Yeah, bugger. The zero-day vulnerability is confirmed and exploitation has been replicated. Open source maintainer has been contacted at this point through vulnerability disclosure processes to start working on fixes. Considering it's an active malicious campaign, the degree of urgency is communicated to the maintainers. The threat intelligence organizations are starting to provide data on the active campaign. Stuff on dark web is seen, indicators are being thrown around various sources. The current indicators of compromise that have been released is destination domains and IPs, some binary hashes, process names, exploitation strings, your kind of normal stuff that will get released for CTI information, which is in that repo, actually, if you do start poking around there. And that's it.
Thank you, Ian. So the incident evolves to the point that open source project needs to look into the issue. So CRob, please educate us on how this large enterprise organization should contact the open source project.
Well, the answer is it depends. Roughly, there are three buckets of capability with an open source project. You're going to have a very large, very well-resourced, very mature project like the Linux kernel or Kubernetes that has a dedicated security team. They're going to have well-documented policies and procedures. They will have a means to take private bug reports and the means to privately test this so that you're not exposing information to the bad guys. Your next tier down is you will have a tranche of projects that are aware security is a thing and they probably should do something about that. If you're lucky, they have a security MD file, a security policy. They might have a mailing list, like please email Fred, who's our security guy, or talk to Sally, who took a class once. Yeah, and then the most prevalent category is going to be, unfortunately, predominant for most single maintainer projects, is they probably don't have a security capability. They aren't aware yet that they need to have this. Maybe this was a academic project or something that their company donated because they thought other people in the community would find use to it. They really didn't think and plan ahead around CVD, which is Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure, which is a very well-documented thing. There's a lot of different permutations to how this will execute in the world. But from this particular incident, the organization should make every attempt to reach the maintainers, the owners, or the security team within that project. Failing finding contact information, you might want to look and see, is this project housed within a larger open source foundation? If it is, great, because a lot of foundations are putting together security teams, or they might have a security developer in residence possibly that could help coach those development teams and that ecosystem. Failing that, there are groups within the ecosystem called CNAs, CVE numbering authorities. These are organizations that take the responsibility to manage vulnerability documentation for certain parts of the ecosystem. And organizations like Red Hat, Google, GitHub are kind of de facto open source CNAs, and they sometimes can help trying to find the developers. And failing that, there are coordination entities. It used to be CertCC, but now that responsibility is taken over by CISA, but there are entities across the world, ENISA, JP-Cert, but CISA would be our point of contact here in the States. I found a problem, I don't know what to do, and the folks can try to help track that down and try to get the right stakeholders engaged.
Thank you, CRob. I feel I need to get a bachelor's degree to understand this process. It's a lot of process. So, Seth, you are the maintainer of this they who not to be named project. What actions are you going to take?
Yeah, so the day is just a regular day for me. I'm at work, I'm eating my lunch, I'm reading my personal email. I see an email about my open source project and something about a vulnerability. I read the report, and it seems serious. There's a lot of pressure being applied in that email because of the situation. If in the best case, my employer is allowing me to work on open source part-time, but in most cases, I'm going to have to wait to get home to be able to do anything about this. So by the time I'm able to get to my laptop, there's been a few more exchanges back and forth. I've asked for more information. It seems like this is potentially a vulnerability, and I'm starting to agree with the reporter. So I open a draft security advisory on GitHub, and from that draft security advisory, I'm able to invite the reporter alongside and anyone else, like I have co-maintainers, invite them alongside to be able to coordinate on the advisory text. I can click a button to get a CVE ID allocated from GitHub, which is very convenient. Thank you, GitHub. And then we can also work on things like what are the affected versions? Is there a proof of concept that we can run through? Here's a potential fix. So we're working back and forth with the reporter with the fix to make sure that everything is good to go before a release is even attempted. By this time, it's noticed that I don't have a security.md file. I don't have draft advisories enabled, so no one can create a draft advisory. I have to create draft advisories. So I go ahead and enable those things so that reporters don't have to email my personal email. They can start working without me. And then at that point, the fixes kind of decided that, okay, this fix is good. We are going to put together a inconspicuous pull request and commit so that it's not just immediately red lights, this is a security fix. Once it lands, we're going to create a private release, probably a patch, and from there we can update the GitHub Security Advisory to say what the fixed version will be because the release is out. But the vulnerability has not yet been disclosed. So at this point, I have a pretty good idea that this vulnerability affects other major corporations, cloud companies, operating systems, you name it. And so I'm going to, with hopefully the help of the reporter, work on getting in contact with people that would be interested in receiving that information before it's public, otherwise known as embargoed information. And then after all of those individuals have been able to triage that report and fix all their versions, then eventually it will be made public. The GitHub Security Advisory will be made public. At that point, GitHub should, in theory, reach out to CVE and say, okay, the CVE ID can now be made public along with the advisory information. And then Dependabot will start rolling out all the pull requests to everyone.
That's a lot of actions that Seth has to take.
And depending on who and how the vulnerability is found, there are upstream mailing lists and groups that help with this coordination. So especially if the project understands their downstream a little bit or their partners, they'll be able to reach out to things like OSS security once it's public or distros when it's private.
That's great call out. So this is a lot of information, and by the way, we are going to document all these details and publish them on GitHub. So if you're busy with taking notes, just keep it in your mind. So as Keith, as Seth busy with fixing the vulnerability using his own spare time, which he requires 26 hours a day. We only have 24 hours. So words got leaked out, and there are a lot of people who are, are eager to give opinions about SaaS slow movement. Hey, you're not doing your job maintaining this open source project. What am I supposed to do? So then the next question is, Sarah, you are a fearlessly open source maintainers advocate. In this situation, what are you going to do to protect SaaS from all these different media scrutinies?
Yeah, so just taking a pause for a second, one of the things that I think is very important is to think through, if you're a maintainer of an open source project, what would you do if you were in this situation? And so to me, this is a lot like a family fire drill plan. We hope that our house doesn't catch on fire in the middle of the night, but just in case, we talk to our kids about where we're going to have a meeting point, out by the back oak tree, or we're going to put signs on the windows where our pets sleep at night. And so this is kind of a preparedness, and it's called a crisis communication plan. And so they can be a lot more elaborate depending on what type of open source project you are. So you may be an individual project. Your project could be associated with a foundation, which means you might have some more resources available to you around a communication plan. And then sometimes your project might be associated with an enterprise, which means you'll have access to some of those enterprise crisis communication response. And then also, while we're working through a vulnerability incident, there are incidents that you might need to think through if you're an open source maintainer that aren't related to vulnerabilities. So maybe some differences of opinions on the interweb, which never happens. So if it is around a vulnerability, which it is, it's very important that when you're thinking through that you try to have the project or those comms and those communications handled or represented as speaking on behalf of the project. This can be a lot harder to do if you are an individual project, but if you can keep the communications crisp, clear-cut, focused on even leveraging a template that you've prepared in advance that focuses on the facts, leave the root cause analysis and kind of what happened as a separate type of communication, and just as you're talking on behalf of the project, focus on the facts of the situation that the industry might need to know. There are resources out there for you. So NIST actually just this month, they have special publication 800-61 revision 3 It's called Incident Response Recommendations and Considerations for Cybersecurity Risk Management. If you can read, you can learn about incident risk management and kind of help think through what your plan might be if you're ever in a situation like this. And then companies, enterprises, projects, even an individual maintainer, sometimes they'll develop a playbook. And I know playbooks can go out the window sometimes, but those are also very helpful to say, what would I do in this situation? What's my template? How am I going to prepare in advance so that when I'm in this very stressful situation, that I can, kind of have muscle memory a little bit on what I'm going to do. Lean on your foundations. If you're an open source project that's part of a foundation, really lean on them to help prepare you for your vulnerability or your incident response. I also was doing a little research for this. CISA has an incident response training. They have an incident response playbook. And so they even have a virtual training on using that CISA incident response playbook at your organization. So there's already some materials out there that you can get started on understanding how you need to prepare. When you're in the midst of it, when you're in the thick of it, emotions are high, it's very hard because a lot of times you put a lot of your own emotions and your own individuality into the projects that you're working on. Sometimes it might be a passion project. So remember, when you're responding to perhaps negative comments on the internet, that you need to help as best you can differentiate between the challenges that someone are having with the project and it's not necessarily a challenge that they're having with you as an individual. And so that's a mantra that you can tell yourself. Lean on a templated response, and wherever possible, if you can, establish relationships where you can have someone who's potentially a paid representative. A lot of times if someone is getting paid to do your incident response and things are kind of angry or the temperature is dialed up a little bit, they are able to keep a little bit more distance between those comments if they're working in a paid capacity on your behalf. Again, this isn't something that every project can do, but those associated with enterprises, those associated with foundations, and even those who maybe think through a little bit can come up with something leveraging their support network. Good support networks to get started with. OpenSSF has a vulnerability disclosures working group, great community. There's a DevRel community there. I recently learned and attended some conferences through an acronym called FIRST, the Forum of Incident Responders and Security Teams. A lot of great resources there. If you're associated with a foundation or an ecosystem, make sure that you are leveraging your network. And then I have people in my network who helped me prepare to help talk to maintainers. So people in your DevRel community, people in your incident response teams or organizations that you collaborate with at OpenSSF, and people in the Vulnerability Disclosures Working Group are going to be great resources as you prepare. Finally, focusing on your mental health and protecting your mental health. So when we are just doing our day-to-day lives, it's kind of like a minivan rolling around town. You change the oil every 5,000, rotate the tires, it's fine. But when you're a Formula One race car and you're racing around the racetrack and things are very intense, you've got to change the oil and you've got to change the tires at a much higher rate. So think, this is an intense situation. It's okay to take time to step back from the situation and get yourself the self-care that you need, and it's going to be different for everybody. So again, speak on behalf of the project. They're not talking to you as an individual, but take care of yourself as an individual to support that. And then as far as digital reputation management, that's something that a lot of large enterprises will do. Not a lot of open source teams are doing that potentially. But if you are associated with a foundation or an enterprise level, you probably have access to a legal department or a PR department that can help you a little bit with like the formal digital reputation management online.
Thank you, Sarah. So self-protection, Seth, and Sarah will also protect you. And also make sure you work 26 hours a day to shoulder the open source projects so that the commercial companies that Rao is responsible for, they can make money, okay? So I think this leads to the next question. So Seth is making changes, making fixes, and collaborating with Rao and Ryan's organization to get the fix in place. Guess what? He depends on the source control system the build system and the package registry to make sure that whatever the final product is, it's still secure. So, Brian Fox, how do you make sure that your system does not become secondary attack vector?
Yeah, I can't tell you. So there's a number of angles to this. I think the other angle that the package registries can play, before I answer your question, can oftentimes be earlier on during the investigation, because we have visibility into where these components came from, who's been downloading them worldwide, so we can give information about the potential spread. If it was something that was just recently published, maybe it hasn't been consumed a lot, or maybe 1 million people have already pulled it, or maybe there's suspicious things going on in certain parts of the world. So we never know what we're looking for, but when these things happen, we immediately go to the data that we have and start trying to see what we can make sense of, especially if it's a case like this one where multiple systems have been compromised. We might start looking around at other adjacent packages to see if there's any similarities in IP numbers and all of that kind of stuff. In terms of securing the actual content in the repository, we've always kind of limited the blast damage to the namespace, so people can only publish to certain namespaces based on the domain that they control, or the project URL if they're on GitHub or something like that. Everything is required to be signed and validated. When things come into our system, we also sign it. So we're in the process of moving these types of things into a more public thing like SigStore, where that auditability can be more transparent. But those are the kind of tripwires that we have, where we can go back and look, has anything changed since we got it? Is it possible that our systems have been compromised? But we also, have multiple different checks and balances. Any of the components coming in, we use, in most cases, low tech kind of things like rsync to pull them in. We're not actually pulling things in and then executing it, right? So we're manipulating the files on the file system in a separate system that's doing the validation from what's actually doing the publishing. The publishing gets replicated out to the CDN. Now these are nuances of how Maven happens to work. Not all of the systems work that way, but it was designed in that low-tech way in the beginning, sort of for these reasons, that we wanted to make sure, that the attack vectors were much more difficult to pull off. And then of course we're always dealing with the types of reports coming in, things that are fishy or malicious. These types of things, we're always on the lookout, not just in our repository, but in other ones. So I think that kind of covers the basis around the role that we play.
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of complexities here, and also for any open source to be secure, it takes the entire ecosystem to be secure. So I think the next question is, for now we know this open source project has vulnerability. So Joe, you support the Rust ecosystem. Usually when one foundation has issues, the other foundations will look at, hey, what am I going to do to proactively manage the risk? What advice do you have here?
Yeah, so obviously, given that some 70% or so vulnerabilities stem from like memory issues, utilizing a memory safe language is probably a natural place to start. And being from the Rust Foundation, I have a bias towards Rust, I guess, but any memory safe language that fits your workflow will do just fine. But I also understand that not everyone can drop it all and just move to a memory safe language for their project, for example. So having like easy and efficient ways to interoperate between existing code and new memory safe code is also very important in this situation as well. But even before you talk about like what language you choose, you also want to figure out where the potential threats might come from. So if you can do some sort of threat modeling around your project, ecosystem, community, to determine where malicious actors may want to target, and then figure out ways preemptively to try to stop those attacks, that's obviously one thing you should do. Like within Rust, we're like looking at crates.io, the infrastructure that Rust supports, the language itself, and the crates ecosystem as well. As you're developing your project, you want to adopt safe and secure coding practices. The language choice is obviously a part of that. But beyond just the coding, you want to regularly check your dependencies for known vulnerabilities, get those patched and updated. At the foundation, we're developing tools like Painter, Sandpit, and Typomania to like detect and follow through on potential threats. And if feasible, you want to have those tools running as part of your CI/CD pipelines. So if you're using GitHub, for example, you want to have like actions that run on every commit or before every release, whatever makes sense for a regular, well-defined cadence for your specific scenario. And then, of course, you'll want to keep continuously training yourself on the most up-to-date security practices, because those things change daily, it seems like. But in the end, I think having the support of like foundations, governments, industries is going to be pivotal to help us get through this process, especially for individual projects who may not have the resources or the capabilities to do all these things by themselves. So it's like one of those sayings, it takes a village to make sure that all this is going to happen.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. So now Seth fixed the problem, and is going to the fix is going to be publicly released, and the CVE number becomes public. So at this point, CRob, how do the organizations have this coordinated release process so that we don't run into chaotic situation?
Like my last answer, I'll say it depends. Typically, like we talk about CVE. CVE is the largest ecosystem of vulnerability identifiers in the industry today. It's not the only, but it is generally, it's the best practice, recommended practice. So as the project and their CNA issues this CVE, then information becomes public as part of the CVE program's information, and then is generally published through things like the National Vulnerability Database, or that'll get into other databases like OSV, the Open Source Vulnerability Schema and Database. Then, as I mentioned before, as if this was coordinated at all, typically the project will have some means with which they advertise this. They'll also publish, in addition to the CVE information, they'll publish an advisory. If you're a corporation, that'll probably be CSAF. If you are an individual maintainer, that's probably going to be something like a GitHub advisory or a commit note or something along those lines. And different projects behave differently. Some people will broadcast to their own project mailing list. Some of them generally, especially if it's if that package is incorporated into a Linux distribution, that'll go out to OSS Security, which is kind of the granddaddy of open source notifications. That's a mailing list you can subscribe to. And then you'll see that information, especially once it hits the NVD, start to filter down into scanning tools. So SIFT and Grape and all the different scanner tools will have this information, and that's how most enterprises will find out about it, unless they read the register. Seth, you were in the register, man, it didn't go great. But normal people will find this out through some type of scan report. Maybe if it's important enough, an organization like CISA will put out a special advisory saying this is a issue of great importance. We encourage you to do something. If it's being exploited, it might get something called KEV, the known exploited vulnerabilities. So that's a special awful class of things. So you might get a KEV notice as well.
Thank you, CRob. A lot to learn here. So I think the next question is, I think this is one for a very tiny cloud provider, AWS. So Bryan, how in case such zero-day vulnerability happens to AWS, how are you going to handle the situation as the lead for vulnerability management?
So first, I'll answer this sort of for a generic company and not exactly what AWS does. That gets me off the hook from official things. But let's just say this, there's multiple threads that we have to think about here. One is, of course, fixing the problem. Unfortunately, in this situation, it's a 9.5 out of 10 on the CVSS score. And it seems like it's generating a lot of buzz in the community. And so, so we're gonna have to work fast understand where are we vulnerable internally, triage those based on which ones are most susceptible to attack, maybe which of those systems hold the most sensitive information, and just start iterating through our world and making sure everything is patched as quickly as possible. But what tends to happen in these situations is that customers will start reaching out to you. Maybe regulatory commissions will start reaching out to you and start saying, hey, have you patched? What's the stance? Is my stuff okay, right? Is really the subcontext there. And it's important to have answers for those things as well. And since there's so many vulnerabilities, we're into the tens of thousands of vulnerabilities a year, you of course would not release like statements on every single one. But things like this that are getting a lot of buzz, you sometimes want to get ahead of that. And so maybe you are going to go ahead and release a statement. Different companies are going to have different postures on if they're going to get ahead of that and release a preemptive statement, or if they're going to wait for customer outreach and just have something boilerplate that they can kind of respond with. But either way, the shape of it is going to be similar. You're going to want to think about what sort of protective controls you've put in place, what compensating controls you have there. So maybe it's a 9.5 out of 10 in the generic case, but because, I don't know, you've used SE Linux in a savvy way, and you were very careful with which ports you had open to the internet, and all these kinds of pieces, you might actually be able to represent that this is really more like a medium in your environment, and people shouldn't be as concerned. That would be a nice message to be able to convey. The other thing that's really nice is to be able to say, hey, we have a very good view into what's going on in our world. We have logs of what's happening, and we have been able to look at the logs dating back all the way to before this vulnerability was even present in our ecosystem, and we verified that it was never exploited, so you have no reason to be concerned, right? Now, that's obviously a perfect best world statement, but if you can make it, it's a great thing to be able to make. So you'd want to be looking through those things. It's all about kind of lowering the blood pressure, right? Because people are really concerned, and you want to help them understand, hey, I've got this, it's under control. Of course, sometimes it's not under control, and then you have to really kind of be thoughtful about what you do. I would just say that companies that try to put a good face forward when it's really not going well internally, often that comes back to bite you. And so you want to work very closely with legal, with PR, et cetera, to make sure that you're making appropriate statements that are not misrepresenting the reality of it.
Thank you, Bryan. Great insight. So now all the companies are trying to figure out, am I being impacted? People are chasing after their vendors about, hey, am I impacted? And organizations, open source world are also trying to figure out, hey, am I impacted? So Michael Lieberman, how is Guac going to help expediting the process of identifying, hey, yeah, I'm fine, or medium risk for me, or I need to do something immediately?
Sure. So there's a couple of things that Guac does. So first and foremost, I think one of the things that kind of came out across the board from all the panelists here is you need data. You need the information at your fingertips. And so if you're recording all the information from all this great software supply chain metadata that is starting to be generated, like your software bill of materials, like in toto attestations like Salsa, like scorecard information and all that sort of stuff, having all of that at your fingertips helps you better respond, because even before the CVE comes out, great, we know there is a 0 day. There's not a CVE out yet, but we know that there's something going on weird here. I am now certifying this package bad. Where does it exist in my ecosystem? Or if I'm an open source maintainer, I know I rely on this package and it's doing something weird. Where else do I rely on it? So not just, you look at one project, but then you also look at it in the broader context of my entire ecosystem. So if you're an organization, if one of these organizations, you want to know, am I impacted in one place? Am I impacted in 1,000 places? And also how? And so Guac helps by sort of pulling in all that information, turning it into a graph of all of that, of essentially facts and opinions on things, and then that helps you better understand where you're impacted. And then when thinking about it more broadly, right, in the future, you want to be able to sort of still continue to record all this information to know, great. I want to make sure in the future I don't pull that back in. And so, you know, when I pull in a new open source project, is that open source project going to yet again pull in one of these vulnerabilities? And then also when looking at the future, how do I start to look at patterns of behavior and patterns of things to start to understand where I should be funding, where I should be pushing money into things? Like, for example, if there are very obvious projects that are maintained maybe by only one person, what can I do to help fund that project, to help contribute to that project? Or in certain cases where, you know, maybe that's just not possible, how do I prevent my use of that project?
Yes, that's great. That's great. So I think that leads to the next question. For Guac to operate properly, it relies on accurate vulnerability information, fine-grained vulnerability information. And we all experience the so-called, I think I'm going to use Brian Fox's word, the NVD meltdown. So I think the question would be for Eric, the OSV.
Happy to. So there's big picture, stepping back a little bit, the purpose of OSV is not to replace CV. It does a great job of like bringing attention to important vulnerabilities. But it historically has got a lot of human readable text fields that are not really amenable to automation. So, and at the volume we have, you might notice we need some automation. And so Guac and OSV and a bunch of tooling in general that's coming, even scorecards fits this category, is really about how can we have systems that are precise, have APIs, and enable automation. So you can think of OSV as a way to store, particularly for open source, vulnerabilities, but with precision around which versions are affected, maybe which, you know, pull requests caused an issue, which pull requests removed an issue, right? Then you can use that graphically with various tools to say, oh, well, I use that package, but I don't use any of the versions that are vulnerable, therefore I'm not vulnerable, right? And so in general, the whole industry, all of us have to move to something that enables automation so that, you know, you can actually update thousands of packages. When we did Log4j, we knew the versions pretty precisely. The problem is they're included in like 2 million of the 8 million things on Maven. And so who's going to go fix those 2 million things, right? And the answer is, our answer was, well, we can do some depend-about-like things, a little bit of version bumping. What worked in practice was we kind of had our top 100 list, which was basically the list of things that weren't patched yet that had the biggest impact, meaning, for example, Log4j was often 6 levels down in your stack. All 6 things in that stack need to be patched, right? And precisely, again, the precision here and automation would really help. But if you're in the middle of that stack, maybe you don't want to do anything yet because the things you need that you depend on aren't fixed yet. So what ended up happening was we would kind of move this wavefront up the chain to try to get the most important things in the top 100 list so they would get fixed as soon as possible to speed up the rest of this wavefront. And that did work pretty well, although even today there's like 30% that never got fixed, right? That is the edge of the wavefront now. But this is the path we want to be on, right? It's precise information that enables more automation with all the ecosystem, the package managers, all these pieces. We're kind of like redoing the tooling on. Yeah. So it's almost more future looking, unfortunately, but it's the path.
That's fantastic. So I think at this point, SaaS basically solved the world's hunger problem. But thanks to the collaboration of this entire panel. Now we are moving on to the next stage of the tabletop exercise, the post-mortem. We are going to have some open discussions. So the first question is, what is CISA's role in open source software security?
Hi, folks. Hi. Stage wasn't big enough for all of us to get up here, but CRob fantastically already covered some of the answer here of what CISA does. For those who don't know me, I've been around open source a while. Aeva Black, section chief for open source security at CISA now. In addition to having a couple roles that were touched on already around being able to help, say, with outreach If the project doesn't have a security.md file or you're not getting a response, we might be able to help. We also have a bunch of connections, not all of just because of me, though I do have a bunch. A lot of what I do is also just ping friends. One of CISA's primary functions, though, is industry coordination for vulnerability disclosure processes. And so if the impact is as big as it has been in this scenario, part of that process and going through the CNAs, CVE numbering authorities would cover a bunch of this, but also CISA does that kind of work as well, reaching out to affected industry partners and private companies that are depending on this open source and helping to prepare the coordination of the fix. CRob mentioned the KEV, the Known Exploited Vulnerability Catalog. That's one way CISA can raise public awareness of like, good gosh, this is really bad. Patch your stuff. The one caveat there is that the KEV requires a CVE is already issued, right? So the sequencing there might be a bit tricky. You got to have the CVE already public to go raise awareness about, hey, go fix it. I guess I'll talk a little bit about one other thing. We actually also ran our own tabletop exercise recently. A couple folks were there. We just published the scenario exercise. Like for this scenario, we published ours last week or the week before, pretty recently. So for those of you out there who are open source project maintainers or work in a foundation that supports open source projects, if you're interested, our scenario covered a little bit of a different angle. What if your maintainers are being directly targeted or your project infrastructure is being targeted by someone with malicious intent? How might you think about and prepare your team? Again, thanks for the shout outs earlier about the awesome stuff that CISA publishes to help maintainers plan and prepare for what to do, because no one wants that. It's a really bad day when it happens, but it's a little bit less bad if you've prepared. I think that's it for my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Aeva, for the introduction of CISA's role. So I think the next discussion would be around the topic, the trust for open source software. I know that in certain industry sectors, there is deep distrust for open source. And also the recent XZ vulnerability also poses the question, is open source secure? So I think we want to have an open discussion here to demystify this topic. Arnaud, you have been in open source since 1990s. What are your thoughts on this topic?
All right, so my name is Arnaud. I'm part of the open technology at IBM. I've been doing open source since 1990. Yes. So, I mean, yes, this is a big topic, and obviously the focus right now on the increasing number of vulnerabilities that come from the software supply chain related to open source only increases the question. I mean, there are people who literally will react in saying, well, prime solve, we stop using open source. Right? I mean, we have heard this, right? I mean, I'm sure you guys have heard it too. And so I think it's clearly a big problem that the industry needs to tackle, which is why a lot of us are involved in OpenSSF, which tries to tackle this problem along with other organizations. So there isn't a solution that's magical that we can all fix. We have to actually engage in this problem. And the big thing that we first need to do is to take responsibility for the software we're using. You know, a lot of companies have taken for granted, well, it's open source, it's free, I can just start using it. And the community will fix it if there's a problem, right? This clearly doesn't work. So the first item we have to tackle is to take responsibility for the free software we use. You know, a former colleague of mine, Chris Ferris, used to say, free software is free as in free puppy. You can go to a shelter and get a puppy for free, but once you have adopted that puppy, you own it, you have to take responsibility for it, right? And so I think the question of trust will come from taking ownership of those responsibilities of the dependencies that we have. First, be intentional about the dependencies you're adding in your software. Too many times people just say, oh, I'll just use this package, that's what I want. Do you really need to add a dependency to your software for this reason? It might actually be more efficient to just rewrite the piece of code or copy the piece of code, not add an external dependency. Of course, you have to respect the license and all that, right? But so there are things like this that are very practical that you can take that will help, you know, understand, take responsibility. I mean, of course, the first thing is to know what dependencies you have. I mean, we've seen in Log4 Shell, I should say, you know, everybody was struggling trying to even figure out where does that impact us? Does it impact us? And then you have those who say, oh, good news, it doesn't impact us because we actually depend on an older version. You mean the one that's 5 years old that has been obsolete and no longer supported? I'm not sure that's really good news. So we have to actually take responsibility, know what these dependencies are, be intentional about it, and manage them. And as I said, I often say, I have an analogy. When it comes to security, we have all this great work that's happening now where we are enabling people with all sorts of tools. You know, you have things like SASA provenance that will give you information about the provenance of the artifacts you're using. We have things like SIGSTOR, which allows us to sign artifacts. But none of this is relevant unless the end users actually verify all of this stuff. And my analogy is like in the auto industry, where we have regulation that say, if you're producing cars, they must have a seat belt. But guess what? Those seat belts are not going to be very useful if people don't fasten their seat belt when they use the car. Similarly, a lot of the technology that we're developing now are just an enabler, and they are not going to be of any use if the end users don't take responsibility and actually make use of all these tools. So back to the question, the notion of trust, again, is it's a matter of doing all the right things. And it's not an easy problem to solve, obviously. I think we all know that, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But slowly, I think, as we take control of all the different pieces and all do our part, I think we will get better at it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great insight. Anyone else? Anything to add here? You talked about everything, everyone's mind, Arnaud.
What do you want me to talk about?
I think you touched on the. I think you touched on some of the topics for the next few things, leveraging the corporate resource for open source maintenance and improving the security. It's shared responsibility in many ways. And also the large corporations have the resource. So open the floor because we have so many large organizations here, Eric.
I'd love to chat on that topic for a second, which is, you know, putting the cloud provider hat on. We have a vulnerability. There's the systems we operate, like the innards of a GKE or something like that for Kubernetes, where we have control of the CI/CD and patching and deployment for that. And we can fix that, and we do. And we can fix Linux, and we can redeploy it underneath you. That all works great. Many, many vulnerabilities are things that are like, you know, packages in Spark or something that are vulnerable. And only the users can actually upgrade those packages. And we can be transparent and say, you're running a version that's got vulnerabilities in it. You shouldn't do that. But we really have no tools to get them to do the upgrade. So this responsibility is kind of like particularly visible here, where it's like the things we control, we can fix. The things customers control, they have to fix. And in fact, sometimes they don't even want to know because they're insured and their insurance becomes invalid. There's all kinds of mess there that it's broken. But I think the main point is we do need to encourage, you know, because these are big customers that say they care about security, right? But their behavior is they don't actually do the upgrade. So I hope we can collectively educate why that might be a problem. And to be fair, one recurring problem has always been that we tend to fix the vulnerabilities at the head, right? That the new version is fixed, but many people are stuck on an old version, typically because the upgrade from that old version is hard to do, right? It requires application level changes, there's a breaking API change, something like that. I think we should also talk about maybe we should patch certain old versions also, which, by the way, what you pay Red Hat for to some degree is to fix old versions. But collectively, we're all depending on people to fix old versions, and they're not getting fixed. So we may need to make that easier by maybe suggesting patches for commonly used versions of important things that are not easy to upgrade. Right? That's a missing category, I would say, in our conversations today.
Yeah. I want to add a piece to that. You talked about being sort of responsible and how, as a company, one uses open source software. I like to point out that part of responsible consumption is contributing back, right? Keeping the upstream secure, keeping the lights on for the infrastructure, the testing framework, the maintainers helping to support them so they aren't suffering from burnout and being vulnerable to social engineering attacks. All of that is part of being a responsible user of open source software at enterprise scale.
Yeah, that's very well said. I think with the digital transformation accelerating more and more, it's super important for the open source maintainers get the support from corporations, because it's beyond the scale of individuals to maintain those critical projects to support millions or billions of software. So the next question is, around incident response, how do we bridge the gap between large organizations and open source project? I think we touched on that a little bit in the previous conversations. Anything more to add here? CRob.
And that is really where many of the organizations represented here can help, because most, all open source developers are developers first. They're not securityologists. They might have taught themselves or gone to school to learn software development, not necessarily the nuances of forensics or memory safe techniques. So how CVD can be improved is through organizations like the OpenSSF, through FIRST, where we talk about what generally accepted industry best practices are. This is how to share information. This is how to help fixing things and how to get that to your downstreams. The Vulnerability Disclosure Working Group is we currently have 2 guides focused on coordinated vulnerability disclosure for open source maintainers and projects. So we wrote the book to help software developers that might not have these skills. We teach them on how things you should do, simple things like having a security MD file, write down what you're going to fix, write down how to get in touch with yourselves, how to get in touch with the project. Then we also have a guide focused on security researchers. And this is a community that isn't necessarily well represented here, but is at other events across the ecosystem. And we explain to these security researchers how open source projects work, how they conduct themselves, where they live, and try to help provide advice to those security researchers to effectively engage with maintainers and to talk about shared expectations and assuming positive intent. And then to complete the trilogy, we are in the steps of creating a CVD guide for open source consumers so that downstream can understand all of the work that goes on before they actually get a patch, and how they can engage with the community, where they need to look to get themselves aware that there are alerts or changes. So the community has done a lot, and that's where be a big brother and big sister to projects, help them instantiate some of these practices, some of these tools. And something as simple as a security MD file or a security.txt file goes so far when a researcher's trying to help I found a problem, I would like to try to help fix it.
So I think CRob touched on the good researchers. And I think one of Seth's struggle is the CVEs being opened irresponsibly. So I know you're very passionate about it. Seth?
Oh, yeah, I can speak to that as well. So owning CVE is something that happens completely externally to yourself if you're not a CVE numbering authority, otherwise known as a CNA. You can get a CVE for a project and never talk to them, and then go to them with a CVE and say, fix my vulnerability. And this has happened to Python a few times where they'll show up with a CVE and we'll essentially say, this is not even a bug fix. This is a nothing, and that CVE will not be rejected. It'll just be disputed. And that ends up showing up in people's scanners, and then we have to answer questions about it, and it becomes a whole thing. And so that's one of the reasons why we became a CVE numbering authority. Obviously, being able to provide high-quality advisories, being able to provide metadata that's correct, that's actionable, providing workarounds, being able to make sure that CVE information is available on the exact same time as the advisory goes out, so you don't have to have someone like go and tap CVE's shoulders that we sent an email. Like all of these are really good reasons why it's just great to be a CNA. It's not a ton of work if the projects that you're covering are few. We only cover 2 projects right now, C, Python, and pip. And another thing that we ended up doing is, because all of this work was fairly opaque at the time that we ended up starting this journey, is we wanted to make sure that other open source projects were going to be able to take advantage of all the things that we learned. And so as a part of the open source OpenSSF Vulnerability Disclosures Working Group, I put together a guide on how to become a CVE numbering authority as an open source project, and all of the things that you'll run into, all the questions, all the forms you need to fill out, all the trainings you need to take, all of those questions answered so that it's really easy to become a CNA.
And thank you, SysS says thank you for all that. Love seeing the growth of CNAs among open source projects. I know there's a couple others that are considering it right now.
Yeah, that's great. So I think that comes down to our final observations. I think we are opening the floor for the audience to ask questions. Everyone's brain is fried.
Hi, so much good thoughts. So thank you all for doing this. One question I have is, we've heard a lot about CISA and NIST and a lot of U.S. government involvement in this, which is great. However, what happens if your primary actors are in Europe or in other parts of the world? How should they be acting? What's different in those cases?
So fortunately, at least within the vendor community, we recognized a long time ago that security is a team sport, and traditional product security and incident response teams, vendor security teams, have broad relationships across the world. So I personally talked to JP CERT and the Korean Security Agency and CERT India. We talked to UK. ENISA is now they've been a strong voice more in like a standard space, like a NIST style, but now they're moving into being more of a CISA style organization. So wherever you live, understand what those governmental resources are, understand what those if you're in a particular vertical, there are ISACs, which is Information Security Sharing Association. Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So if you are in energy or telco or finance, there are these industry groups where they are commercial entities like yourselves potentially that get together and talk about, I had this problem, I'm seeing this activity, does anyone else seen this? And so there are a lot of groups in the world that share that information, and it isn't constrained in borders. But CISA and NIST have been very vocal on this for a long time, but the rest of the world definitely participates, and if you're in the UK, reach out to there are organizations there that help, that are resources in country. So
just to chip in, so NCSC are kind of the UK equivalent in this space, but like CRob said, the intelligence communities are broad and vast. Everybody shares information nowadays.
Any more questions?
Hello. I have kind of a big open source project question. We're talking a little bit in this group and all throughout the day about the importance of bringing corporate funding into it, however you define funding. Do you all have counter arguments for concerns around essentially privatized open source at that point, like open source that's a little bit too close to that kind of cathedral model? Because I would love to hear them.
So as someone who's paid to do open source full-time, specifically security, I really like the model that Alpha Omega has adopted in hiring security champions specifically at foundations that represent the ecosystems themselves, because it provides just the amount of separation that makes it comfortable to say, okay, I am acting on best behalf of the Python ecosystem in particular. And I think that also adds a giant amount of trust in me from the actual ecosystem, because if I'm hired and there's no trust in what I'm doing from the ecosystem, I'm going to be completely ineffective in what I need to do. And so having that trust there is really, really important. So I think foundations are pretty uniquely positioned to do this.
And I'll add a little more flavor to response. Some projects, open source is just a licensing model. Some projects have a community that is a bunch of collaborators from different companies, countries, etc., working together. And some open source projects are primarily just backed by one company. That's something certainly to consider as you're looking at open source projects. How is it supported? Who is supporting it? And are there a diversity of folks whose time is going into the project as well?
I agree with your concerns, and that's certainly the reason OpenSSF exists in some sense, is to not be a single company thing. But CNCF in some ways is more instructive, because when we did CNCF, one of its purposes was to own the Kubernetes trademark, which means that Google couldn't take it away from you as a threat, right? And so there's kind of levels of openness, like, are you sharing the code? Are you kind of building a community? Are you sharing real governance? And you can actually look at those levels and decide which ones you're comfortable with. And they're all valid models. I think that we actually need the mix, but I think it's important to be able to understand that these differences they carry weight, that it matters, especially for international projects where you don't really want something to be also viewed as US-centric necessarily. So all these tools are all tools in the toolbox to get more diversity and more participation as well.
I think when an open source project is seen as funded by a corporation, there's always going to be some level of distrust. But I think as your project goes along, it's going to be based upon the actions of that project. So if the project is doing positive things for the community and the ecosystem, where it's funded from becomes less of a factor, because it's become a positive influence to the developers' ecosystem's lives and all that sort of stuff. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. You need that funding in order to have projects go forward, but the people managing the project hopefully have enough control over it that they can show, yeah, this funding is going to be is done for good. So.
And there's a model in the ecosystem that the Linux distros take, in that they will either hire somebody within the community or work with someone within that community, much like how Seth is with Python, where you try to get people that are embedded in that group and participate in that community. As Arun says, they chop wood and carry water, they do the documentation on CVEs, they help with advisories. So that's where corporations and large entities can help earn trust, is by being those daily helpers within those communities and doing some of that hard work and showing, building that trust.
It's also where the foundation can play a role, is setting clear guidelines and communication around the maturity of a project's participation in community, and ensuring that, for example, any project that is at a certain level on the graduation, like sandbox, incubating, graduated tiering, has multiple companies all sharing that responsibility, so there's less risk of a single company changing their mind about it. And so some of the foundations do help to share that information in a more easily accessible way.
So just a real quick question as a follow-on to your point. At a panel just before lunch, we talked about a perception of a change in the outlook from large government entities that maybe 3 years ago were saying, wow, this open source ecosystem's a mess and what are you all going to do about it? To more of a, wow, this open source ecosystem is a significant digital public good and we also consume it. What are the thoughts of the panel about ways in which perhaps governments should start to look at not just consuming, but more actively both contributing back to in terms of engineering talent and coding, but also contributing back in terms of good old time and treasure? Thank you.
Fun fact, global governments are some of the largest consumers and also internal producers of open source software. And there's a certain responsibility when you're working as a public servant, and there are a lot of rules around what you can and can't do. And I'm very heartened. I've been in this space for about a decade. I've seen that sea change where globally governments are now much more open to having their employees be able to participate more freely and contribute back to open source works that they use or they create. It's not perfect, but it's, you know, I've seen that transition where we're seeing a lot more participation and a lot more open-mindedness when engaging with open source, a lot more thoughtfulness on how to be a partner.
Makar?
Eric, did you want to say something first?
I'll just say that this shift in government view on this is something I've been working on for a long time, and it's worth celebrating how much has changed. CISA now exists, for example.
They hired me.
That's good. There's an open source security strategy. The U.S. has a strategy written down, right?
And a roadmap even.
And a roadmap, right? So these are side effects of the executive order, right? Which are, of course, side effects of the fact that open source is critical to all citizens, roughly, in all countries. So I think that realization, in fact, the IS and CISA has to do with infrastructure security, right? It's the pipelines and the things like that, all of which have open source somewhere inside them. So this is, you take it under that view, it's kind of obvious that it's a public good, just like all infrastructure is. But that is a relatively recent shift, and we have to, frankly, keep the pressure on. So we should all be expecting more from all of our governments on this front. And I think it's somewhat inevitable, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen for sure, right? At the same time, it needs to happen, but we also need to keep the pressure on.
So just to give a view from across the pond, so to speak. So within European government, typically they're not the most well-funded in terms of developers. So the issue with contributing back there is they're low on time and low on resource and low on funding. So they're one of the biggest consumers of open source. Within limitations, there's a lot of red tape and guardrails within government, especially in the European region. But I think there is a core fundamental issue there, right? Is if you're going to consume something, you should contribute back. How do you find the time and kind of money to allow them to contribute back? So it's definitely an issue across the pond. I can't speak to kind of stateside, but it's an issue.
I have a controversial question and an assumptive close, because it's after 5, and that means we're cutting into happy hour time. The controversial question, and I will start with a caveat. I recognize the open source community isn't a homogeneous view, and that's the beauty of the community. But one of the challenges that we've had is within the community, in my observation, the place I came from was financial sector and tech. And when bad people on the internet were trying to do bad things to you that you may not have full visibility into, you get a little tap on the shoulder by a 3-letter agency, you go into a secret room where you're not allowed to bring your cell phone, they tell you stuff, you come out,
and you address the stuff. Not every member of the community is going to be cool with that, but we do need to find a way to get stuff that may not be visible to maintainers or repository owners, stuff like that, into the right hands, rather than allowing sometimes the constraints and bureaucracy to allow bad things to happen to good people. So would love thoughts on that. But the assumptive close was, and Dana, we've captured so many great things today. How are we going to get it back out to the community? But why don't we deal with the spicy question first?
I'm here from I guess technically a 3-letter agency, right? So this is part of DHS, that's 3 letters. And I'll open the comments by saying, one of my biggest concerns right now as people struggle to address this kind of question, which is super important to find a way to address, especially in light of XZ and the sort of proof that we now have that the international détente, folks not using open source as a vehicle for international conflict, who knows? My big concern is, out of fear, people undermine the very basis of the community trust that has made open source so valuable and so beneficial to the world. That's my worry. So however we work to find an answer to this, we have to keep open, global, collaborative communities thriving.
So, amen on that. I completely agree with Aeva's position there. I would also push back a little bit on some folks in that people look at open source as being potential for misuse. Because XZ is open source, that's why we know about it. Yes. 100%. If that was proprietary, we would have missed it.
Well, it would have just been an offshore contract team that no one would have noticed.
Yeah, 100%. Now, does that mean you should go depend upon this random small project maintained by one person? You have to consume your open source software with thoughtfulness. And if you aren't, you're going to get in trouble. Many people are not.
And there are some guidelines on how to be a responsible consumer of open source. CISA and NSA, another 3-letter agency, published one in December.
Just going to add that I think we talked a lot about CISA today, but the CISA Kev is actually, in my view, a good vehicle for this kind of stuff, where we can actually disseminate, like, hey, these things are being actively exploited. It would be useful to put some attention to them. And I can imagine, having previously worked for the government, but with no knowledge of how the Kev is created, that it could be a way to disseminate that kind of stuff in a somewhat sterile way, right? And I think that's hugely valuable. And we talked earlier today about how the limitation of the Kev is, of course, that you have to have a CVE first. But I can also imagine a future world where we could find ways to scratch that itch a little bit as well. So that, combined with the idea that, yeah, we're getting a view into how some of these threat actors might operate, and we can learn from that and then go use it to secure other things in the future, are all hugely valuable, and we shouldn't miss that opportunity.
Just a real 10 seconds, that's all I need. There are open source projects for this, especially within the CTI space. So the MIST project tracks indicators against pretty much everything in the world. A lot of government organizations will use this, and they will host platforms for you. So I think it's Circle, the Luxembourg CTI organization, they will host their own instance. So if you're looking specifically for what's going on where and what indicators are available, there are open source projects that track this.
Happy hour.
I think there's one.
Woo.
Oh, does that one not work?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. just, yeah. So I think we had a lot of discussion about like what you could do in the time that you're like discovering a vulnerability. This is not related to the government at all. This is related to actually the tabletop exercise. Oh my God, sorry. So we've got 2 maintainers in the house, scorecard over here, All-Star. These are projects that you can use within the OpenSSF ecosystem that allow you to detect various things about the security posture of open source repositories or internal repositories too, if you're using the local functionality. Things that we talked about, like discovering who the contributors and the maintainers are and what their security policies are. We comprise a score of how secure, I think, based on your definition of secure, your repo is, right? So you should check these projects out. And that's it.
Okay, so Omkar, do you want to deliver the closing remark so that people can enjoy the happy hour? No, you do it. All right, so I'll do it. So thanks everyone for spending time here, and I want to give a special shout out to our event team and also our OpenSSF staff members. So really appreciate everyone spent time here, and collective intelligence does make a difference. And our maintainers are endangered species, so let's protect them. Thanks everyone, and see you next time.